of them.
3 quiet words in a crypt full of dead Starks, and they might be the single most important line Robert Baratheon ever says in the entire show. Because for the next several seasons, basically everyone treats this man like a joke. A fat, drunk, whoring king who'd rather be jousting than ruling. But strip away the gut and the wine stains and look at what Robert Baratheon actually gets right, and you get a very different character. Underneath the punchline is a man who called the real threat before anyone else in Westeros even knew there was a threat to call. Let's be honest about the reputation first, because the show absolutely builds it on purpose. We meet Robert falling off his horse, red-faced and heavier than Ned remembers, and the first thing out of his mouth to his oldest friend is basically a fat joke about himself.
You got fat.
A few scenes later, his own squire can't fit him into his armour, and instead of being embarrassed, Robert turns it into a bit. Send the boy off to find a breastplate stretcher that doesn't exist, just to watch him panic. It's funny. It's also, if you want to read into it a little, a pretty tidy piece of symbolism. The armour doesn't fit anymore, neither does the crown. He just laughs about one of them, and that reputation follows him all the way to the end. He dies, gloriously, to a pig. If you wanted to design a king for people to laugh at and pity in roughly equal measure, you'd design Robert Baratheon, which is exactly why almost nobody clocks the crypt scene. Before there's a small council, before there's a war of 5 kings, before a single person in King's Landing is losing sleep over a name across the narrow sea, Robert is already standing over Lyanna Stark's tomb, correcting Ned.
Targaryens are gone.
Not all of them.
Nobody in the room reacts. It plays like a throwaway line in episode 1. In hindsight, it's basically the thesis statement for the whole series. So what happens once the rest of the room finally catches up to him? A few episodes later, we get the small council scene, and it's genuinely one of the best written arguments in the entire show, because both men are half right, and both men are half wrong. The whore is pregnant, Robert announces, and it only gets uglier from there. I want them dead, mother and child both, he says. Ned calls it murder, Robert calls it survival, and the logic underneath his rage isn't just a king throwing a tantrum. He lays out with real precision how a foreign invasion led by someone with dragon blood could unravel 7 kingdoms that barely tolerate each other on a good day. Ned's rebuttal is the line that ages worst in the whole series. He says he'll fear the Dothraki the day they teach their horses to run on water. Except the horses were never the problem. The dragons were. The single most honourable man in Westeros is so confident in his own read of the situation that he doesn't even seriously entertain what he's dismissing. Mark Addy plays this whole scene with something that isn't quite rage if you actually watch his eyes instead of his volume. There's a flicker of something closer to fear right before he lands on "she dies," like a man trying to outshout his own dread. That's not the performance of a warmonger having a good time. That's a man convinced disaster is coming and finding out nobody at the table is going to help him stop it. Now, is Robert the only person in that room who wants her dead? No. Varys, Pycelle, even his own brother Renly all agree with him, for their own reasons. What actually separates Robert isn't that he's alone, it's timing and reasoning. He'd flagged this in a Winterfell crypt, off the record, before it was ever a council matter at all. And his logic wasn't just a vague, we can't allow a Targaryen restoration, it was specifically about what a dragon and a horde do to castles built to survive medieval sieges, not something that flies over the wall. 7 seasons later, give or take a few plot detours, that's almost exactly how it plays out. Here's the part I find genuinely moving though, because Robert doesn't get to die smug about being right. Half poisoned and gored by a boar, he grabs Ned's hand and tells him the girl, Daenerys, you were right, then begs him to call off the assassination if it's not too late. That's not Robert changing his mind about whether she's dangerous. It's Robert, maybe the only time all season, choosing mercy over fear, even though fear was the correct read. Machiavelli spent a whole chapter of The Prince arguing it's safer for a ruler to be feared than loved. Robert spends his entire reign living that philosophy out loud, and then, dying, breaks his own rule for a child he's never going to meet. If that's foolishness, it's a very specific, very human kind. And honestly, I think the thing people undersell most about Robert is exactly this: the charm. Go back and watch the Winterfell reunion. You've got fat, he tells Ned, and the two of them just start laughing like 9 years haven't passed at all. "Cat," he shouts at Catelyn, genuinely delighted, before he's even fully off his horse. He's self-aware, too, about exactly what kind of king he's become. "I eat, drink, and whore my way to an early grave," he tells Ned, only half joking, while literally trying to hand him the actual job of running the kingdom. A man that honest about his own rot is rarer on this show than you'd think, and it's part of why soldiers followed him into 2 rebellions, and why Ned still loves him even while furious with him. Then there's Lyanna, and this is where Robert stops being funny and starts being genuinely tragic. In the crypt, touching her statue's face, he tells Ned she belonged with me. Then, quieter, "In my dreams, I kill him every night." Later, alone with Cersei over dinner, a scene I've actually broken down in full elsewhere on this channel, so I won't relitigate the whole thing here. He admits he can barely remember what Lyanna looked like anymore. He only knows she was the one thing he ever wanted, and that an entire kingdom couldn't fill the hole she left. That's not romantic. That's a man who has spent 17 years married to a woman he has functionally never seen. The books make this crueler. According to Cersei's own account, on their wedding night, a drunk Robert called her by Lyanna's name instead of her own. The show never puts that on screen, but it hands you the same wound in a softer wrapper, and it genuinely explains a lot about who Cersei becomes. That's maybe the quietest, cruelest irony of this whole character. Robert spends the entire season sensing exactly the threat that's going to burn his dynasty down from the outside, while the woman sitting across the dinner table from him, humiliated, resentful, married to a ghost, is already becoming the one who's going to burn it down from the inside. He saw Daenerys coming from across the world. He never saw Cersei, sitting 3 feet away from him. That duality is basically his whole ruling style, too. It's fear and blood, he snaps at Ned in that same council scene, when Ned tries to talk about honor. And that's a man who understands power in a way Ned never quite lets himself. But it's also a man who hasn't looked at a treasury ledger in 9 years, and would rather break his own ribs jousting than sit through one more small council meeting. Some of that probably traces back further than the throne itself. His own father drowned at sea when Robert was still a boy, and he and Ned were both raised afterward under Jon Arryn's roof at the Eyrie, which is exactly why I loved "That man carries so much weight" when Robert says it about Jon in episode 1. And exactly why "Help him, Ned, make him better than me" lands so hard on his deathbed with Joffrey. Robert never really had a model for being a father, or for being anything other than a soldier. He's sharp and decisive exactly when the stakes are existential, and almost completely checked out the rest of the time. That's not really a contradiction. That's just what happens when you hand a war hero a throne instead of another war. I do think the show softens him for it. And I'll say what I usually end up saying about this era of the writers. They get a lot of criticism, especially for where they eventually took the ending. But Robert is genuinely one of their better needle threads. Mark Addy plays him jovial enough that you like him, tragic enough that you mourn him, and self-destructive enough that his death never feels like a random accident so much as an inevitability that was always going to arrive one way or another. In the books, he's grimmer, heavier, sicker, sadder, a man visibly rotting in real time. And it's honestly harder to laugh at him on the page than it is on screen. And yes, Season 8 is the most argued over stretch of this entire show, for a whole lot of reasons. But if there's one thing the ending actually validates, it's a dead king's paranoia from 7 years earlier. Which brings us to the pig. "My memory," he says, half laughing at his own joke while he's bleeding out. "King Robert Baratheon, murdered by a pig." It's the funniest and saddest line he gets, and it's the last thing he says about his own legacy before he asks for the milk of the poppy to end the pain. The man who saw the real war coming dies to livestock, mid-sentence, before he can lift a finger to stop the thing he'd been warning everyone about since episode 1. And once he's gone, everyone finds out exactly how right he was, just far too late for it to matter. Robert Baratheon isn't a fool. He's a man who was right about the one thing that actually mattered, and wrong about almost everything else. And somehow, that exact combination is what makes him one of the most human characters this show ever gave us. The human heart in conflict with itself, wearing a crown it never wanted, warning everyone about a fire it saw coming and still couldn't put out. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching.